George Kilpatrick Inspiration for the Nation, celebrating people that we feel good about. But we got a superstar in the house. We're celebrating Kwanzaa, and this is the celebration of the sixth day of Kwanzaa. And of course, the sixth day of Kwanzaa is Kuumba, to do always as much as we can in the way we can in order to leave our community more beautiful and beneficial than we inherited it. And I could not think of one better person to celebrate Kuumba or to talk about what that means as none other than visual artist extraordinaire, MacArthur Fellow genius, Carrie Mae Weems. Carrie, so good to see you. And also, we've asked Carrie to remember one of the ancestors now, Bell Hooks. So we'll talk about both of those things in our conversation. And just for context, Bell Hooks, when we celebrated Carrie's 60th birthday, which was a few years ago, Bell Hooks had some very nice things to say about Carrie. So we wanted to give Carrie the opportunity to say something about Bell. But before we do that, let's talk about Kuumba and creativity and how your work and how your how you challenge us to look at life, to look at race, to look at gender, to really, and also your work in the community and how you use that principle in your life. Talk to me, Carrie.
Oh my God. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with Kuumba and how you use Kuumba and how Kuumba reflects and relates to you.
Well, you know, George, one of the things that I appreciate about you are the questions that you ask. So it's really put me in a space of reflection and consideration. You know, I think as an artist, as a woman, and as an artist, and as a person who's deeply curious, I've always thought that from the very beginning, early on in my life as an artist, that I knew that the field was much bigger than I, much larger than me, and that the most important thing that I could do would be to ask certain kinds of questions, not necessarily answer them all, because that's impossible, but to ask certain kinds of critical questions that would land us in a certain kind of space of reflection and consideration. And so I think that, you know, from the very beginning of my career, I've started in that way. You know, if we're saying that we want to leave the field in our communities and life better than we found it.
Yes.
And what does that mean? What does that mean tangibly? Not as an abstract, but tangibly. And so I knew that one of the things that I wanted to do very early was to have a serious impact on the way in which visual arts, photography, painting, sculpture, performance, and music, etc., were understood in the ways in which Black people in particular participated in the field. And not only participated in the field, but how they were actually broadening the field by their participation, right? You know, so what are they doing? How are they doing it? How are they thinking about it? What are they making? What are they saying about it? Who's showing it? Who's engaging it? Who's writing about it? How's it being taught? How's it being shown in institutions and museums? How's it being taught in colleges, in universities, and schools, right? We're really hunkering down in that space and asking all of these critical questions. And so no matter where I went, I always had a set of questions that I posed not only for myself, first and foremost, because that's the most important part, starting with you, starting with the self. And then how does that feed out and pan out from the self, right? And so going into universities and institutions and asking them questions about who we are, what we are, how they're engaging. For instance, the question, the similar question that I began to ask myself in 1985 was the question of what would it mean for the quote minority to become the majority in the country. What would that mean? And I started talking about that a long time ago. And now in 2021, 2022, by 2025, we know that America will be primarily a country that has shifted from white to Black and varying shades of brown, and that this is having extraordinary implications and will have extraordinary implications into the future.
And so when I'm listening to you, and I always feel myself being expanded, I think what you're challenging us to do in this idea of Kuumba creativity is to think differently about the way we approach things, or don't look at the status quo. That's kind of what I get from you. Am I on the track here?
I think that that's true. I think that that's true. But I think that the future is now. The future in some ways belongs to us in a very critical way. How do we use it? How do we engage it? How do we think about it? And within that is this nexus of creativity that is explosive, that is taking the world by storm. Suddenly, institutions that I've been talking to for the last 35 years, 40 years, about this sort of shift, this demographic shift that is going to have deep implications for them, right? And so they need to be prepared for the coming of this day. Well, these words were coming out of the mouths of a Black woman. So who listens to Black women in these sort of primary institutions? There was no need to. They didn't understand it. They didn't see that it was possible. And they didn't care.
Right.
Right? Because they couldn't imagine that a future without themselves in a dominant position.
But at the same time, you never stopped asking the question.
And
right?
I never stopped asking.
And I really want to push into that a little bit, because I think in order for us to make our communities better, sometimes we get comfortable with the questions we already asked without considering, as you just suggest, asking the implications of what is next, or continuing to, I'm still going to ask, I'm still going to ask, I'm still going to ask. We still need to answer. And then one day, here we are, right? A question you asked back in 1985. Now we're seeing what so many years later, the implications of that. So what does it take for us to continue to be persistent in that truth, right? Because it also has to be a level of, I'm not going to let this go, because this is what I believe is critical.
I've often heard for many years, I heard from people after I might present a lecture or an exhibition or a performance, or, of how courageous I was.
Right.
And I think for a long time, I really didn't understand what they were really saying, because I didn't really think of it as being courageous. I simply thought of it as being obvious.
Right.
Simply obvious. But sometimes, of course, asking the obvious question is the thing that gets a lot of people in trouble. And so I think that, one of the things that I try, I'm not a martyr by any means. I'm just a woman. I'm just a woman out here working in the world. But I do have very deep commitments. And I feel a great sense of responsibility, not only to myself, but to the communities that I represent, and to my family and to my friends, to stand on that ground of criticality, and know that it may not advance me. It may not advance my career. It may even hurt my career. And I'm probably sure that in some ways it has, in ways that I don't even understand or could even imagine, right? Because power is not something that rests so comfortably within my hands. But nevertheless, I'm committed to certain kinds of ideas and pushing for what I believe in. And if I look across the spectrum of great artists, all of them have done the same thing. I was actually looking last night at the Kennedy Center Awards, and Berry Gordy was awarded last night. And in his presentation, he talked about Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye's album, his particular album of What's Going On.
What's going on?
What's going on? And when Barry first heard it, he thought, Marvin, this is going to ruin your career. You really need to think about whether or not you really want to put out this album. And Marvin was insistent that this album be produced and that Barry produce it and that it go into the public. And we now know, 30 years later, that it reshaped the musical imagination and that it became one of the most important anthems.
Right.
It became the entire album became one of the most important anthems of the last 50 years. There's nothing greater.
Yeah, and so to your point about artists, right? The ability and the confidence, because you also earlier said something about Black women and their voices, and the confidence to speak that truth at the risk of, right? Is that the definition of artist?
Well, Toni Morrison said that the freedom is the ability to take risk.
Mm-hmm.
That freedom is the ability to take risk. And so to that extent, I'm not sure if all artists feel that way.
Okay.
Because I can't speak for all artists. But I do know that for the most part, artists are interested in a certain amount of freedom of expression.
Sure enough.
Right? That we are interested in freedom of expression. And within that then is this sort of great position of this wonderful solace of knowing that you've been able to express yourself across the discipline in which you have applied yourself. And whether or not that takes you down the road you imagined, whether or not it sort of short circuits a career, and certainly careers have been short circuited by speaking out, by speaking truth to power. Nonetheless, it's the position that I need to live in. I can't imagine really living in any other kind of way.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing you, and so I hear that, especially in this time of Kwanzaa and reflection and thinking about how our community is better, right? In what ways do you feel like your work has done that for us?
I can't say. I can't really say. I mean, I think I have to leave that to others to really claim. I can only say what I'm attempting.
Talk to me then. Talk to me then.
And that is, again, broadening the dialogue, broadening the conversation, making the conversation much more inclusive, asking critical questions at critical but inconvenient times, right? In order to sort of push for something that doesn't exist, something that doesn't quite exist yet. And so we know that our communities are troubled. They are disenfranchised. They are underfunded. They are underrepresented. And to that extent, that I can stand now in my 60s, approaching my seventh decade on the planet, knowing that the work has been embraced, knowing that the work has had incredible influence amongst other artists, other younger artists who have like a broader future than the future that I had. That I'm able to sort of use myself, my body, my perspective, my ideas as a way of pushing through the muck, of pushing through the mire, of challenging those institutions and allowing a whole other group of artists to come behind me who might have it easier. I'm happier with that. I'm happy with that.
On this piece of creativity, Kuumba, and celebration of Kwanzaa, what would you want the rest of us to do in this idea of asking the critical questions or standing on the truth, what would your recommendation, suggestion, how do we ask those questions? How do we expand our thinking? What would you ask of us as we think about your legacy, as we think about the questions that you've asked? What would you ask of us as we consider our own ways of building our community and making it better? What would you ask of us?
That's such a great question. It's such a great question, and it's a complicated question.
Absolutely.
When I drive through my community here in Syracuse, when I drive through our community and I look around it and I see what's going on, I see the sort of the deterioration of the community. I see the deterioration of housing. Mm-hmm. Right? That I don't see any businesses, that I don't see any, decent grocery stores, that there's no wonderful nightclub, there's no gathering space. There are all of these ways in which the system has denied us. And yet, historically, it's been true that there have always been ways we figured out a way of making no way out of a way.
Right.
Right. Of making a way out of no way. And now the challenge is upon us, right? And I think we, that a part of our responsibility is, what is our responsibility to ourselves? How do we take care of ourselves, and how do we nurture ourselves? How do we build community in an active way? And it's not all about, money and finance always matters, absolutely, right? But there's also something about ingenuity.
Sure, no.
That our families coming out of the South, coming out of desperate situations, far desperate than they are today, managed to figure out ways of hanging in, of staying together, of building community when the forces against them were even greater than the forces are today, right? And so I think that there's another level of responsibility that we have to challenge ourselves in another kind of way, right? That we have to step up in another kind of way. We have to claim our future for ourselves, right? And communities are changing and shifting. So what does it mean? I think one of the questions now is, well, what does it mean to be a community?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a community? Because it's not what it was 50 years ago or even 25 years ago. It's changed dramatically. And as cities are sort of pulling apart, right? Where communities are pulling apart, right? By all kinds of forces that are at work on them, right? Reinstituting ideas about community and what we want to see in our neighborhoods becomes even more critical than ever before. And so I'm dedicated to my community. I'm dedicated to working in it. I'm dedicated to working with young people in it. I hope this summer to, again, have my project, Social Studies, back online, where we're training young people to think outside the box, right? To figure out other modes of work, because work is also changing. What work is changing, right? And so there are all of these dynamics that are at play, and a part of our responsibility is understanding what those dynamics are. What work is going to be in 10 years is not what work was last year. With the pandemic, we know that we can now all work from home.
Yeah.
So businesses have simply shifted all of their energy. They're closing their offices. They're closing these gigantic centers, and they're giving individuals the right to work from home. Well, how do we participate in that?
Yeah.
right? And what are some of the ways in which we need to come together, not simply as sort of quote communities, but a sort of broad-based initiative to really sort of look at the ways in which work is going to change and how we can be deeply involved in this sort of creative energy that's taking place. It's an amazing dynamic and critical time that we have to be a part of in a fresh way. And old ideas need to go to the wayside, and new ideas need to come forth, right? And I'm looking to younger people to tell me what their futures will be.
That's Kuumba creativity, to do always as much as we can in the way we can in order to leave our community more beautiful and beneficial than we inherited it. And it's part of our responsibility. We lost a ancestor this past week, Bell Hooks, and I know that you and her were contemporaries. What do you want to say about our dear sister?
Oh my God. I haven't really, in a serious way, George, I haven't really quite processed Bell's passing. So, I've just, wrapped up a very large exhibition in New York City at the Park Avenue Armory. The show closes in a couple of weeks. But during that time, just before we opened, we also lost our dear brother, Greg Tate, the wonderful critic and musician, and poet and writer, and just an extraordinary man on the planet. And one of the things that we were able to do during that gathering, I invited maybe 80 to 100 other artists, musicians, and writers, and critics, and poets, and choreographers, dancers, to participate in a weekend-long convening with me to sort of explore ideas around notions of future, right? Of the notion of the future, right? Who's in it? But we started every day with a salute to Greg Tate. To a salute to Greg Tate. I gathered up all of his writings, a long list of his writings, his contribution to the field, what that looked like. And every morning, at 12 noon every day, we spent a moment of silence and then read the list of his contributions, his writings, his novels, his critical essays, etc. It was very important. As Bell said, in order to heal, you need a community. You do that in a community. You don't do it alone. And so it was a way of recognizing him. And then of course Bell passed the next week. Bell was an extraordinary woman, brilliant, a star. I met her at the height of her power, where she was very much in demand, and everybody was clamoring for a piece of Bell Hooks, of her writing, of her presence, of her speeches, of her books, of her poetry, of her brilliance, in lectures and presentations. I mean, she was simply she was everywhere. She was everywhere. And then I was with her towards the end of her life, 2 years ago, where she was starting to get somewhat frail, and she was no longer on the quote circuit. She was no longer on the circuit, and younger writers and artists and critics were coming along who deserved their place also in the world. And Bell said to me, Carrie, when you're doing something, please invite me. I'm still here. I'm still working. I'm still the same Bell. And so I invited her to do a few things. And then of course, COVID closed down some of our opportunities. But Bell was a really brilliant woman. Bell was not only brilliant, but she was also selfish. She was also mean, but she was also generous. And she was also full of grace. She was a woman. She was a person with all that comes with all the contradiction that comes with. But the thing that I remember most about Belle is her extraordinary brilliance and her extraordinary insight into the possibilities of understanding the complexities of who we are as Black people in America, with our extraordinary insight and our extraordinary gift to deliver on a promise that is absolutely unique in the world,
right.
And how to bring that forward. I will forever be in her debt.
Bell Hooks, being remembered by her dear friend, Carrie Mae Weems. Carrie, it's so good to talk with you, be with you. And I just want folks to know that when the piece that you commissioned where people from all over the world talked about you, I just so appreciate the gift that you are in this moment to the world, right? Because you're asking those questions that need to be asked and giving us much to think about as we move forward through this very difficult time in our country and in our communities. But we are the ones we've been waiting for. I've heard that before, right? We are the ones that we've been waiting for. And we all have an opportunity to use the spaces that we have to make our communities better. And you're doing exactly that. So I want to thank you for what you're doing in this moment.
I am nobody. I'm nobody, but I am proud to carry my father's name.
Mm-hmm.
I'm proud to carry that name. All I know is that it's really step up time.
Yes,
that if there was ever a moment, that this moment is now, and that there is an opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity of advance, of sort of a forward motion that has never existed before, that is sitting in our grasp. And how we grasp it matters. How we take advantage of this moment matters deeply. George, thank you so much for doing what you do. I cherish you, and I hope to see you at church on Sunday.
Amen, amen, and amen. That's Carrie Mae Weems, y'all, visual artist, photographer, extraordinary. Her work speaks for itself. And Carrie, we just so appreciate the work that you're doing, helping us to celebrate Kwanzaa, an inspiration for the nation. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.